All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us once again for our Emerging Revolutionary War Revelry that we host every other Sunday night here at 7 p.m. live on our Facebook page, and they'll be later broadcast and archived onto our YouTube channel and our podcast as well. I'm Kevin Pollock with Emerging Revolutionary War, and I'm very greatly honored to be joined this evening by Eric Schnitzer, who is a historian and interpreter with Saratoga National Historical Park, and also provided the excellent text for a great book on the Saratoga Campaign alongside Don Troiani's paintings and artifacts, titled Don Troiani's Campaign to Saratoga, 1777, the turning point of the Revolutionary War in paintings, artifacts, and historical narrative. Eric has been a park ranger at Saratoga for close to 26 years. Is that correct, Eric?
It is, Kevin.
So we are very honored and delighted to have you here this evening. So thank you for joining us.
Well, it's a very generous and kind introduction. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, you know, when we were putting together our lineup of future programs for these revelries, we said there's a huge glaring hole in what we haven't talked about. And weirdly enough, Saratoga was one of those. And we figured there'd be no better person than yourself to provide us some insight into the Saratoga campaign as a whole, some of the nitty gritty of the fighting at Saratoga and the different battles that took place during the campaign. So Eric, start with the big stage, the big picture for us. What brings the two warring armies to Saratoga in September and October of 1777?
What a great question. Probably one of the most common questions we get at Saratoga Battlefield when visitors come and they overlook from our visitor center, which is on a hill, right? They overlook the battlefield below them and they wonder, why here? Why were these two armies clashing here? What were they fighting about? How is it that they ended up here in the middle of what appears to be nowhere? And it all started, if we're looking strategically, if we're going to the top view of things, it all happened in England when General Burgoyne submitted his plan, his own plan that he wrote. He proposed it to the Crown. And what he wanted to do was have the army from Canada come out of Canada, the province of Quebec, and the army would descend into upstate New York and capture Albany. That was the plan. Now, when you read most histories of the Northern Campaign of 1777, not all of them, but most of them, they will tell you that General Burgoyne was trying to link up his army with General Howe's army in Albany. General Howe was supposed to come up from New York City, or General Burgoyne was supposed to capture all the lakes and the rivers like Lake Champlain, Lake George, Hudson River, and he was going to establish fortifications and outposts along the way, thereby cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies, etc. None of those things were actually really what was going on. The principal and only plan was that Burgoyne's army would come out, like I said, come out of Canada, capture Albany. He would be joined by a secondary force coming also out of Canada via the Great Lakes. That military expedition commanded by Colonel Barryson Ledger would move down the Mohawk Valley and meet Burgoyne at Albany. And from there, Burgoyne's army would receive further instructions from General Howe as to how to proceed. There was talk about maybe Burgoyne's army would be ordered down to New York City and join the British garrison there. Maybe General Burgoyne's army would move on Rhode Island and join the British garrison there. Or maybe General Burgoyne's army would attack Boston. They just didn't know. It was an open-ended plan. And General Howe would make the decision based upon the circumstances, the operational circumstances that the armies faced at the time. I have to add, if I may, one of the crucial points regarding this plan is an understanding of the British organization of the armies in North America during the Revolutionary War. By 1776, and for the rest of the Revolutionary War, British command in North America was divided into two major groups. One major group was the 13 Colonies Army, which also incorporated Nova Scotia and the two Floridas. And in 1777, that was Sir William Howe's jurisdiction. That was his department, his domain. But the most of Canada, including the province of Quebec, that was under a completely separate jurisdiction in 1777, commanded by Sir Guy Carleton. Carleton and Howe are separate commanders. One is not above the other. So when Burgoyne submits his plan, he wants to take that Quebec province army out of the province of Quebec and bring it into the main military campaign zone under Howe. That was really the gist of what they were looking to do.
And so what was the importance of Albany for the British Army? Why head towards Albany? Why is that the objective?
Yeah, the objective was Albany for a couple of reasons. First, it was the perfect midpoint between British-held, say, Montreal, Quebec, and the city of New York. It was the perfect midpoint. It was also located very near the confluence of the Mohawk and Hudson rivers. So that was a good location to be at for controlling any kind of, let's say, fortifications along waterways. Fortifications typically happen to be on waterways, right? So Fort Edward, Fort Ticonderoga, of course, Fort Schuyler, i.e. Fort Stanwix, those kinds of fortifications, again, typically near waterways, if not on waterways. And if they're not on waterways, they protect portage points like Fort Schuyler does. And again, Albany is a great staging area for any kind of further military operations, because again, Burgoyne's plan was open-ended. You capture Albany and then what? When we look back at the 7 Years' War, when the British were making their military efforts north, let's say in 1758, 1759, those military forces were staged in Albany, and they would move north from Albany. So Albany was still in the mindset of the British command as being a place that you capture in order to further, go on campaign somewhere, be it east or be it south.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So rather than just flipping the script, instead of moving back north, move south or east from there. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what about the American response to the British plan? Once the British Army under Burgoyne and St. Leger's force begin to move, what do the Americans have in the way of anything to protect the Hudson River Valley and protect Albany in 1777?
Yeah. So an unfortunate fallout of the year 1776 and Washington's efforts against Howe down in New Jersey, particularly, is that his army, Washington's army, had been so sapped of its strength because of various losses, like at Fort Washington and the Battle of Long Island, etc. Washington needed more troops at the end of 1776. At the end of 1776, the fall of 1776, the Northern Army was fairly strong at Ticonderoga. The British come out of Canada in 1776. General Carleton, he's looking at capturing Ticonderoga in the fall of 76. But by the time he gets near the fort, his scouts inform him that the fort is too heavily garrisoned, and there's no way that the British will be able to invest the fort in time for, to wrap things up before the winter hits. So he goes back to Canada. Don't let anybody tell you that the Battle of Valcour Island turned Carleton back to Canada. It did not. It didn't slow him down. It didn't delay his advance. What delayed his advance is simply the lateness of the season in the face of a superior American army behind prepared defenses at Ticonderoga and certainly Mount Independence on the other side of the lake. So Carleton goes back to Canada. Washington needs more troops. What does Washington do? Well, he calls out most of the Ticonderoga garrison. Now, much of the Ticonderoga garrison, their enlistment dates were expiring because the Continental Army in the year 1776 was primarily a one-year service army. So a lot of the troops who had enlisted in late 75, their enlistments are now expiring in late 76. So they're going home. Also, Washington needs more troops, so he saps the Ticonderoga garrison. Now we fast forward to 1777, long story short, when Burgoyne descends on Ticonderoga, it's a weakened garrison because they had never really replenished it to the numbers necessary. Arthur Sinclair, the second in command of the Northern Department of the Continental Army under the auspices of Philip Schuyler, has a paltry 4,000 or so officers and men in the face of Burgoyne, who has over twice the number. Now, military theorists would, of course, say, well, 3 times is what you need to attack prepared defenses successfully. And that might be true in theory, and in practice, often it does demonstrate that is the case. But that's not a hard and fast equation that always computes out to be a fact, right? So could Burgoyne have taken Fort Ticonderoga, even though he only outnumbered Sinclair by just over 2-1 instead of 3-1? Of course he could have, especially since the Ticonderoga defenses were a bit untenable thanks to some certain weak points, such as Mount Defiance, that enormous height. It's a mountain really overlooking Fort Ticonderoga. It's part of Fort Ticonderoga Association's property. It's beautiful. If you can go up there, you can look down on Fort Ticonderoga. It's awesome. And although the British never actually got cannons on top of Mount Defiance by the time the Americans evacuated, the Americans were fully aware that the British were probably going to do just that. And so they preemptively evacuated. And it's a good thing because they saved the army rather than trying to fight a losing defensive battle and then retreat or try to retreat when it was just too late to do so. So as the American army is retreating, they have a paltry number when compared to the British. They lost almost all of their artillery pieces at Ticonderoga and Mount Independence. So they're now lacking artillery almost 100%. They'll garner more artillery as the campaign progresses, but from the get-go, when they retreat in July, they got nothing, really, artillery-wise. Like I said, they're already grossly outnumbered. They are, I don't want to exaggerate it, but they are a bit ill-equipped. As I, sometimes like to point out, part of the Ticonderoga garrison, just short of Burgoyne's arrival, had been issued with spears to defend the walls of the fort. And they had muskets by this point, but only just, As for clothing, a lot of the troops just didn't have clothing and they're threadbare. I mean, we have Continental soldiers and officers during the course of the retreat talking about how, because they lost all their baggage at Fort Ticonderoga, aside from what they could carry, they are, naked, as they sometimes say, which is not a literal thing like naked from head to toe. It's what they mean is that they are disheveled, that they have a lack of clothing, their clothing's falling apart. And you have soldiers and officers talk about how they have to drink out of their hats, out of the crowns of their hats, because they don't have drinking vessels, because those things were lost during the retreat. So it was chaotic. It was just an awful time to be a Continental or militia soldier during the retreat. So in the summer of 1777, things were looking really bad for the state of defense for the American cause in upstate New York.
Yeah, that does not sound like the American force we think of once we get to Saratoga itself. There will be, of course, some changes in command to that. So before we get back into the campaign, I think what's sort of interesting about Saratoga is sort of thinking of the popular memory of Saratoga. Most folks are aware that it is a turning point and generally regarded as such of the American Revolution. We can get more into that later on. But you don't have, with the exception of perhaps Benedict Arnold, who I know we will touch on later on, you don't have a lot of the big names of the revolution, if you will, on either side at Saratoga. And I think Burgoyne is, of course, known about because of his role in the Saratoga campaign. But of course, on the American side as well, you're going to have Horatio Gates. So give us an idea of some of the command structures of both these armies. Who are the generals that are leading their soldiers into this campaign?
Yeah. Well, on Burgoyne's end, as you mentioned, General John Burgoyne, he's a lieutenant general, and he is in command of the army, of course. His second in command is a major general named William Phillips, who, he's part of the army from Canada. He's an ordnance general. He's actually an officer in the Royal Regiment of Artillery with the army rank of major general. And later on in the war, after he's exchanged, ironically for Benjamin Lincoln, who was at Saratoga, later captured at Charleston, later in the war, William Phillips ends up in Virginia and dies there in Virginia, in fact. This is before Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown. Burgoyne's third in command is a German officer, because much of Burgoyne's army is comprised of things other than British redcoats and British blue boys, the artillerymen. He's got German soldiers too. They hail from what's called Herzogtum Braunschweig, which is the Duchy of Brunswick, as well as Grafschaft Hessen-Hanau, the county of Hanau. And so he has proper Hessians with his army, those soldiers from Hessen-Hanau, but he's got mostly Brunswickers. And all of the Germans are led by a major general by the name of Friedrich Riedesel. Friedrich Riedesel. A very, very good, solid commander who had proved himself in the 7 Years' War. Frankly, so did Burgoyne, too, if we're honest, and so did William Phillips. They all did very well in the 7 Years' War, but they never commanded armies, right? None of them had ever had an army-level command before this one in 1777. So Burgoyne had never commanded an army before. Doesn't mean he couldn't have done it successfully. It just means that he's rather new to the concept of having to deal with everything an army commander has to deal with. As for probably the most famous commanding officer with Burgoyne, I would say it's probably Simon Fraser. Simon Fraser's a brigadier general. He had the local rank of brigadier general. He was the lieutenant colonel of the 24th Regiment of Foot. He commanded one of Burgoyne's more elite battalions. The 24th Regiment was extra well practiced at treeing tactics and that kind of thing. Fraser was very keen on that. But Fraser, and I think this is probably why he's the most famous of all of Burgoyne's sub-commanders, is because he ends up getting mortally wounded in the Second Battle of Saratoga. General Fraser is one of only 2 British generals to be killed or mortally wounded in battle during the entire war. The British, all the battles they fought in from 75 to 83, count 83, not much going on there, but let's count it. Only 2 British generals lost their lives because of mortal wounds or being outright killed. The other general,
Rev War barroom trivia for you.
Yes, right, yeah. The other general was Brigadier General Agnew at the Battle of Germantown, but that's it, right? So that's kind of a big deal, As for the American command, indeed, we don't have the Marquis de Lafayette. We don't have Nathaniel Greene. We don't have George Washington. We get Horatio Gates, who, I think the latest work by Mark Lender on the so-called Conway Cabal has demonstrated well that Horatio Gates and what he did during the so-called cabal against Washington was not as nefarious as most historians would like to make it out to be. Camden's a bit hard to explain, admittedly. I'm glad I wasn't in his shoes, but nevertheless, you don't get out of something like Camden and have a stellar career if you're Horatio Gates. You can't fail upward, in that way. Benedict Arnold, of course, he is the person that if anybody comes to Saratoga battlefield, Benedict Arnold, he's the main star attraction, and frankly, rightfully so, considering the brilliance of his work at the battles of Saratoga. I would say that was his high watermark in his entire military career. As for other famous commanders, we have Daniel Morgan, certainly, is high up there. We have also Henry Dearborn, Alexander Scammell. We have James Wilkinson, which, worse than Horatio Gates, if you ask me, certainly. And Daniel Shays, he's there too. Shays Rebellion, post-Revolutionary War. Yeah, he's there too as a captain in Rufus Putnam's 5th Massachusetts Regiment.
Yeah, and you've done a lot of work going kind of from generals down to the private soldiers of both armies. You've done a lot of work with the battlefield of sort of highlighting some of those soldiers. So give us 1 or 2 maybe your favorite stories of some of the private individuals, either in the British force or the American force at Saratoga,
Sure.
And what's kind of drawn you to highlighting those stories.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking this. I don't know how long it was, maybe 8 years ago, I decided to embark on a massive research project. I knew it would take me a very long time to work on. It's not complete, but it's getting toward the point where I can say, wow, results. This is really something else after all of these years of work. I call it In Memoriam. And it is a complete cataloging of every single American who was killed or mortally wounded or simply wounded, died of disease, died of injury, or was simply sick, etc. at the time of the battles of Saratoga. And it was born of my desire to remember every single American who lost their lives at the time of the battles of Saratoga, with the Northern Army, of course. I'm focused on that at the time of the battles of Saratoga. So let's say a soldier contracted a sickness in the Northern Army and he ended up dying. So he never fought in the battles, but he was sick at the time of the battles. He's a casualty of being in the military at large. So he might not have been killed in battle, but certainly so many others were. And I wanted to do this for many, many reasons, but I just wanted to know the American soldiers more, officers and men. And further, I knew we could do it thanks to, frankly, it's mostly a New England army, and the New England genealogical records are very good in most cases. But the more that the longer I worked at Saratoga National Historical Park and we focus on the battles and everything else, I wanted to focus more on the fact that it's a cemetery, you know? It's not an officially designated national cemetery, such as you'd have at Gettysburg, for example, with Soldiers Cemetery, but it is a cemetery regardless. There are those buried there from the battles of Saratoga, some of which we know where they're buried, and they have modern day stones, no stones from the 18th century, but kind of collecting all the names that we can, and we can then more appropriately memorialize those who lost their lives in the service of their country. So anyway, I wanted to do this work, and like I said, it's ongoing, but some of the stories of casualties have struck me in ways I couldn't imagine. I tell you, looking for the stories of these personal stories in the family records, the genealogies, matching them with the military records, I have had my mind blown on multiple occasions. There was a soldier, for example, he was in James Livingston's battalion of forces, the so-called 1st Canadian Regiment, continental soldier, private soldier. He had served nearly since the war had begun. And I knew from the original muster rolls that he was a casualty, listed, killed, and then the date, October 11th. So I knew that he was killed in the siege of Saratoga. So following the battles of Saratoga, the British tried to retreat north. They only made it 8 miles north of the battlefield at Saratoga to a place that was then called Saratoga. The battles of Saratoga, like the Battle of Bennington, were not actually fought in Saratoga, nor was the Battle of Bennington fought in Bennington. They were fought elsewhere. So this soldier, I knew he was killed. The muster rolls informed me that, so okay. And then I look in various records, pension records, also the memoirs and journals of the soldiers who were in that unit. And I found no less than 3 different individuals from the early 19th century recollecting in their pension depositions. One soldier, kind of like Joseph Plum Martin, wrote an entire memoir of his service in the war. It's not as good as Joseph Plum Martin, but this guy really wanted to do it, and it's unpublished, right? But we have a copy of it. And he devoted 2 pages to the death of this single individual, this private soldier by the name of Asil Terrell. Private Terrell, according to the various eyewitnesses, because they were all there when it happened, was on guard duty with them. And it was during the siege of Saratoga, so it jibes perfectly with the military record, the date of his death, right? And according to the narratives, the soldiers talk about how, like I said, they were on guard duty, the cannonading was going on, both sides were shooting cannons back and forth. And Asil Terrell then started talking about how he had been at Ticonderoga in 1758 during Abercrombie's failed attempt to take Carillon from the French, right? Ticonderoga. And he talked about how, it was, melee combat, the Highlanders with drawn broadswords and cannons, he said, were shooting from the French lines. And then as he's regaling his companions with these stories, according to the eyewitnesses, a cannonball from the British line literally just takes the guy's head clean off, just like that. Before they even knew it happened, his head was removed. Now, the way they describe it, because you got to wonder, what does that look like? Oh my God, that's awful, What does that look like? What are they talking about, this head being removed from this man's shoulders? They say that his head, I don't want to be too graphic, but it's history, right? It's battle.
Yeah, it's what they recorded.
Yeah, it is. It's exactly what they recorded. It's a traumatic amputation, His head was taken clean off, and his bones, his skull fragments, his bones and brains, as well as blood, smattered all of the soldiers next to them. And it was just the shocking thing that occurred to them. And it occurred before they even knew what was happening. It was instantaneous. One soldier was so wounded by a skull fragment from Terrell's head that it hit him in the eye, and he lost his eye from this. And he applied for pension, says, hey, I was wounded because this guy's head was taken off and a skull fragment made me lose my eye because, it went right into my eye, and I lost my sight permanently. I mean, it was just so bad. And this one narrator in the memoir that he wrote, James Selkirk, he was a sergeant. He described the aftermath of the shock and the trauma that he felt, how he was covered with brain matter and blood and everything. It's like, holy cow. And this is just the death of one person. Imagine how many other people suffered similar fates, and we don't know. Next to their name on a muster roll, it says killed September 7th or September 19th, and it's like, Okay, but what happened? How were you killed? Was it a bullet? Was it a cannonball, a piece of case shot? What was it? With so many of them, we'll never know. I am glad. I mean, it's all awful, right? It's terrible stuff. We're talking about the loss of human life, but the more we know about it, the better we are at understanding the poor lives of the people of the past who lost their lives. And I'd say more than half of them, we have some kind of narrative regarding their death or their being wounded, some kind of narrative associated with it. So my overall project is to catalog every single known reference, every anecdote, anything in the military records, pension depositions, what have you, to like I said, better understand these soldiers. And if I may, also, I'm looking for things like ages. And this is something that just blew my mind. I have done some statistics. And all of the Americans between the two battles of Saratoga, all of the Americans who were killed or mortally wounded, if you divide them up by decade of age, there was one guy in his 60s, a few in their 50s, and the lower you go, you get more and more and more numbers. Well, a plurality of casualties occurred amongst the teenagers. And when you take the teenagers, for those we have the ages for, we have I can identify the ages of about a little over 2/3 of the Americans who became casualties. So there's a big mystery as to, some soldiers, I can't find anything on them. I got their name, I got their military unit, I can maybe tell you what town they came from in New Hampshire, but so far I cannot connect them with an actual person in any genealogical record. But when we look at the teenage casualties, we find that a plurality of those who were casualties, they weren't 19-year-olds, they weren't 18-year-olds, weren't 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds. And you had 15 and 14-year-olds too who were casualties. So it's just it's not that we couldn't have imagined this, but it's validating what we thought might have been the case in a horrible situation for these poor teenage boys, losing their lives.
Well, I appreciate you doing all that work, as does the greater Revolutionary War, historian community. I think, of course, in later wars, or more recent wars, I should say, we do have a lot, and that's, of course, a growing trend in military history studies, is highlighting the experiences of common soldiers. And for the American Revolution, I think it can be difficult to piece all those records together to portray or paint a fuller picture of the common soldier of the American Revolution. But you've done some great work in highlighting that. And the story that you just told is one I had not heard before, from following the Saratoga National Historical Park Facebook page and seeing where a lot of those stories are posted. So if those of you that are listening, if you have not followed that page, I would definitely suggest doing that, because there really are some great, touching, sad, heartrending stories that you've been able to find about some of the Americans that fought at Saratoga. So I appreciate you highlighting that and the work you've done on that. So I will say, if anybody does have any questions that's joining us, please feel free to enter those into the comments section on Facebook. We'll do our best to get to those. We do still have a lot of ground to cover here. So Eric, if you could do sort of the Saratoga Campaign, we know about the two battles of Saratoga, the siege of Saratoga that gives its name to the campaign itself, but there is a lot of moving parts, as you already mentioned, with several different columns to the campaign, and fights at Bennington, Hubbardton, and other places as well in New York and beyond New York even. So sort of bring the armies, once the campaign begins, bring the armies to Saratoga, if you will, highlighting some of those other sections. And some of those places I've been to as well, like Bennington and Hubbardton, and some are really nicely preserved sites that have a lot of good interpretation for visitors to go and see.
Right, can do. Yeah, sure. So things really kick off when the two armies first initially come into contact with each other at Ticonderoga, which is right up on Lake Champlain. The American defenders do evacuate the fortification at Ticonderoga and its sister fortification across Lake Champlain called Mount Independence. So the American army evacuates, thankfully, because that army is the core of the army that ends up fighting in the battles of Saratoga. As for historic sites, Fort Ticonderoga is one of the gems of Revolutionary War sites, truly, and French and Indian War, frankly, too. It's just tremendous. It is a privately run historic site. They have a very immersive, very excellent living history program. incredible 18th century and early 19th century military museum inside with unbelievable artifacts. I mean, it's truly magnificent. Highly recommended. Well-preserved site. The whole, much of that Ticonderoga Peninsula is preserved. It's just a gem. Across the lake, Mount Independence is also a gem site. It's not like Ticonderoga insofar as you go visit it, it's a reconstructed fort. Now, they don't have that at Mount Independence, but what they do have is the remnants of the original fortification complex that existed from 1776 to 77, which is when Mount Independence was used. It's a Vermont State Historic Site, and it's just a beautiful location. They have a visitor center, and you can take the various trails, and you can see the remnants of the various structures and buildings that were on top of the mount. Following the capture of those two posts, the British ended up pursuing the retreating Americans. Part of the British forces chased the Americans, the main body, into Vermont, and they wind up going against the American rear guard at Hubbardton. Hubbardton is the only battle site of the Revolutionary War fought in Vermont. It's a phenomenal Vermont State Historic Site. I remember Ed Barse once told me that he believed that the Hubbardton battlefield was one of maybe even the best preserved battlefield in North America. It's unbelievable. It's untouched. It's tremendous. And the reason is because it's in the middle of the mountains of Vermont, and it's just stunningly beautiful. To think that a gory battle occurred there on site is difficult to imagine, but it's just a phenomenal site. British forces also pursued the Americans up the lake, meaning south, because the lake actually flows north. So they pursued the Americans up the lake south to what is now called Whitehall, Steensboro in the 18th century, and then further to Fort Anne. Fort Anne is where you had a battle occur one day later after the Battle of Hubbardton. The Battle of Hubbardton was fought on the 7th of July, Fort Anne on the 8th of July, and you had this fight happen. Both sides backed off, but the British were the victors. They did hold the field of battle at the end, so they were victorious there, just like the British were victorious at Hubbardton and victorious in taking Ticonderoga. The British advance kind of stymied at that point. When you get to the middle part of July, they were still advancing south, but they had difficulty in doing it because of the logistics issues, which is a whole subject unto itself. And it's really the thing that was Burgoyne's biggest enemy at this time. It come mid-July, early mid-July, the logistics, the transportation difficulties, because what he had to deal with is moving his army and all of its stuff, right, all of its materiel south, using Lake Champlain, which is great, but Lake Champlain, if you go further and further south, you get to Wood Creek, which most of Wood Creek is navigable by one bateau at a time. And so you don't have a large body of water where you can turn boats around and everything. They couldn't do it. So it was a logistical nightmare. Plus, the cart road that existed was not compatible with heavy artillery or anything like that. So Burgoyne had to make alternate plans to move his artillery south, and he did so via Lake George. Anyway, it took him weeks to get his army finally on a foothold on the Hudson River at Fort Edward. They were able to capture Fort Edward. The Americans had abandoned the place. They were able to capture Fort Edward at the tail end of July of 1777. So Burgoyne then is still waiting and waiting. Stuff is accumulating with his army. The American army at the same time is retreating in the face of Burgoyne's advance. They're always keeping at a certain distance. In other words, Philip Schuyler, the commander of the Northern Army, Arthur Sinclair was his second in command. Philip Schuyler didn't want to retreat wholesale all the way down to Albany. He wanted to keep a close proximity to Burgoyne, but not too close, because Burgoyne has almost every advantage by this point, So you have a lot of skirmishes that take place between the petite guerre forces of the two armies. But by getting into the second week of August, Burgoyne decides that he's going to make his final push on Albany. And so he sends out a detachment of Germans and Royalist Americans with First Nations people, and they are destined for Bennington, Vermont. Long story short, but finally they settled on Bennington, Vermont as their destination. Simultaneous with this movement, Burgoyne was going to capture Albany. He was just going to go for it, right? This is now the middle of August. The American army, the Northern Army, was not ready for this. Well, come to find out, as the British, mostly German force was near Bennington, about 8 miles outside of Bennington, Vermont, they're still in New York. They're set upon by mostly New Hampshire and Massachusetts militia, with some Vermonters thrown in there too for the mix, under the command of General Stark, a great hero of the Revolution for sure. Unfortunately, he wasn't at Saratoga, at the battles of Saratoga. He was at Bennington, but good thing he was there because he performed brilliantly. And not only was that initial force that Burgoyne sent out cut to pieces, but a relief force sent to help out the initial force was beaten to a pulp and retreated, limped back to join Burgoyne's army. And it was the Battle of Bennington. It was a great victory, one of the great decisive victories of the war, like Cowpens, it's that kind of level of victory. And it is going to change operational affairs completely for the rest of the campaign. As for Bennington, Bennington Battlefield is a New York State historic site located in Walloomsac, New York, which is where the battle was actually fought. It's a tremendous location. They have there preserved most of the battlefields, especially the really important famous ones like the hilltop fortification and the so-called Tory Redoubt and the ancillary locations as well, the bridgehead, etc. So it's just fantastic. And again, it's a New York State historic site. Bennington, the town in Vermont itself, actually has an enormous obelisk commemorating the victory in the Battle of Bennington. And I'm thinking that most people that visit it assume that the battle was fought there, but it was not. It was fought about 8 miles to the west in New York. But that monument is a cool place. It's a Vermont State Historic Site. If you can get up to the top, check it out. That was where they were trying to go. The contingent that was sent out in that way, that Stark beat handedly. So Burgoyne is literally going to have to delay his further advance on Albany for an entire month because of the defeat in the Battle of Bennington, no joke. Finally, a month later, mid-September now, he's finally ready to move on Albany. He crosses the Hudson River in mid-September. He gets to the west side of the river, then he advances south. By this time, the Northern Army, the American Army, got a new commander, Horatio Gates. Schuyler's gone. He got reinforcements in the form of Continental and militia troops, most especially the Corps of Riflemen that George Washington sent up directly because Philip Schuyler throughout the summer had been begging and pleading Washington to send riflemen north. And finally, Washington sent up his beloved riflemen under the command of Daniel Morgan. And it was a mixed battalion of Virginian and Pennsylvania riflemen, 400 in number. The Northern Army was comprised otherwise of New Englanders and New Yorkers. Nobody had a rifle. It's a Southern thing. It's endemic to the South when it comes to rifling in North America. It's endemic to the South, Pennsylvania on south, not New York, not New England. So riflemen were highly desired. They arrived in the latter part of August. So he receives reinforcements. They get a fresh replenishment of things like tents and some new uniforms, not everything, but they got some better clothing. They're now being properly fed. And they got cannons. They finally were able to scrounge together artillery pieces, so much so that the Gates felt confident enough to move the army north to a place called Bemis Heights, which is about the place where the battles of Saratoga were fought. The first battle on September 19th, the second battle on the 7th of October. 2.5 weeks separate the two battles of Saratoga. After the battles were fought, the British were bested. The first battle was technically a British victory, but it was a Pyrrhic one. They couldn't capitalize on that victory, but they hadn't technically been defeated. The Americans were the ones who gave ground. So 2.5 weeks later, second battle was fought, decisive American victory. And so the British the next day begin to retreat north 8 miles to a place that was then called Saratoga, now called Schuylerville. And that's where Burgoyne ended up surrendering. Very briefly, as for the St. Leger expedition that was meant to join Burgoyne in Albany via the Mohawk River Valley, that expedition set out and it was over almost before it began. They traverse Oneida Lake, which is kind of a bridging lake between the Great Lakes and the Mohawk River. They traverse Oneida Lake and they get to, they're approaching the headwaters of the Mohawk, and then they realize that Fort Schuyler, i.e. Fort Stanwix, was garrisoned. really well. And they did not expect it. They should have. They had intelligence that told them that, but St. Leger was haughty or otherwise something was wrong. The German, the senior German officer in his expedition force said that St. Leger was drunk half the time. So maybe that had something to do with it. I don't know, but St. Leger did not make good choices. And so he got caught up in the siege of Fort Schuyler, i.e. Stanwix. And then you have the subsequent Battle of Oriskany. Oriskany battlefield is a beautiful New York State historic site. Highly recommended if, like the other battlefields, to visit. That's an amazing one. Also, Fort Schuyler, Fort Stanwix, as it's known today. I got to call it Fort Schuyler because that's the official name as of 1776 when it was reclaimed for American independence. But Fort Stanwix is a national park. It's a national historical monument, and it's tremendous. It's a reconstructed fort. It's absolutely amazing. It's in the middle of the city of Rome, and they got a great museum, and the reconstructed fort on the original footprint of the fort is awesome. And then to cap everything off, something I hadn't mentioned yet, but as Burgoyne his campaign is waning and he's not doing very well, he asks for help from the British forces in the city of New York. Sir Henry Clinton. Sir Henry Clinton comes up from the city of New York, and Clinton, is able to attack Forts Montgomery and Fort Clinton, not named after the British General Clinton, but an American General Clinton, and he defeats the American garrisons there. Fort Montgomery is a New York State historic site. It's not a reconstruction. It's on the Hudson River, right? It's not a reconstruction, but it's the remnants of the original fort, and they have a fantastic museum, and it's just a tremendous historic site there too. Like Mount Independence, you got the historic site which preserves the remnants of the fortifications. But unlike Mount Independence, there was an actual battle, a serious battle fought at Fort Montgomery. And Sir Henry Clinton ascends the Hudson River as far north as Claremont. He's about 80 miles outside of Albany, his forces are. But once they learn Burgoyne surrendered, they go back.
And I think that's one of the great things about the Saratoga campaign is there is so much that you can see related to these sites. And I would agree, my words don't mean as much as Ed Barr certainly, but Hubbardton is just an incredible battlefield. I'd never thought of it as one of the best, if not the best preserved in North America. But now thinking about it after hearing that story, I would tend to agree with that, I think.
Ed told me that himself.
It's just incredible.
And if Ed says it, then I agree.
yeah, there you go. Exactly. That's a very smart line to take. I like
that's
that.
Right.
So we had one question here. I want to get into Benedict Arnold, because whether you love him or you hate him, Benedict Arnold is somebody that attracts a lot of attention and, of course, has a very large role to play at Saratoga. But we did have a question from a viewer asking more about the siege of Saratoga, that we hear so much about the two battles at Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights and Brayman's Redoubt on October the 7th. But tell us a little bit more about the siege.
Sure. Yeah. The siege takes place over the course of about a few days, let's say. So the British retreat beginning on the 8th of October, the day following the Second Battle of Saratoga. And so the retreat takes place beginning on the 8th, all through the 9th of October. Their retreat was slowed to a slog thanks to a ridiculously powerful thunderstorm that occurred for half the day. Torrential downpour. It just slowed everything down to a crawl. And Burgoyne's, call it Achilles' heel if you want, during the retreat is the fact that, the soldiers, they can move at a certain pace and they divest themselves of all manner of baggage that you can imagine. They take a lot with them still. They burn some along the way because they're just trying to throw everything off that they can. But the thing that Burgoyne cannot leave behind is the bateaux that are in the Hudson River because they carry his food supplies. So he is more than once his retreat column stops because they're waiting for the boats to go against the current north on the Hudson River, right? During this torrential downpour to catch up with his army, the rowboats, and there's some scows in there, which they're poling in the ground, right? In the Hudson. So these things are moving at a snail's pace. Burgoyne cannot lose contact with them. And so that slows his advance. Finally, they get to Saratoga on the night of the 9th of October. And into the morning of the 10th. They're burning houses along the way, houses owned by rebels like Philip Schuyler, for example. They burn his country estate. The American army, commanded by Horatio Gates, very clever. What do? Do they pursue Burgoyne in that torrential downpour? No, they wait until the 10th of October. Horatio Gates orders most of his army to leave all baggage behind, every bit of it, all ordnance stores, artillery, everything stays in camp. It will catch up with us later, he says, but everybody's to take a couple days worth of provisions and nothing but blankets. That's it. And we're going. And with celerity, they just shoot on up to Saratoga like lightning. It took them hours to do something that Burgoyne's army took a day to do. No joke. They get up there, and by the time the American army reaches Burgoyne, this is now the early afternoon, late morning of the 10th of October, the American forces begin to surround Burgoyne. And what happens over the next few days is that the Americans are continuing to make their encirclement of the British positions, which the British positions are kind of on alongside the Hudson River in the valley of what is now Schuylerville. If you look on like Google Maps, you look at Schuylerville, they're in the low ground there and in the rising high ground going west. And he's built fortification complexes in this community with artillery, because he brought his artillery with him, and they're trying to defend themselves against this American encirclement. As for the Americans, you know, they had 22 pieces of artillery, and now they've got nearly 10 more that they captured from the British in the Second Battle of Saratoga. So the Americans have as much artillery as the British do, and the American artillery is on average bigger than the British artillery is by this point because of the captured British guns. And so the Americans begin to cannonade the British positions, and the British are cannonading likewise. And so this active cannonading is ongoing from the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, a 3-day time frame. And it's in this time frame that Private Terrell was killed by that cannonball taking his head off. And he, if I may, he wasn't the only one. There are a couple of other soldiers and officers who were killed by cannon shot. We know from other references. His though was the most graphic, that was memorized and memorialized rather by other people who saw it occur, and they never forgot it. You know, after a 3-day proper cannonading back and forth with skirmishing, etc., General Burgoyne offers a truce. You know, the stereotypical drummer with the white flag, it's a handkerchief, but that's what initiated it. And so from that point, for the next couple of days, you have a ceasefire in play. And both sides are negotiating about how best to surrender. And it's a really interesting story unto itself, what happened during these negotiations. But in the end, the agreement was called the Convention of Saratoga. And it would allow all of the Royalist Americans, the French Canadians, all of the non-combatants, the First Nations people, although they had already left by the time of the Siege of Saratoga. There weren't any left with Burgoyne's army. They were all allowed to go back to Canada or even back home from whence they came. But the Germans, the British, right, the followers, their wives and children, they were going to be prisoners. For the short term, they'd be marched out to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there picked up by the Royal Navy and sent back to Europe, so long as they are not recycled back into the British military over here in North America during the rest of the present war. That was the plan. It didn't go according to plan, but that was the plan agreed to by General Burgoyne.
I was just about to ask if the British held to that plan, but it seems like it never does when something like that happens.
Well, it's very interesting. So we now know things that the Americans didn't know about what the British were up to, and we know some things that the Americans were up to that the British didn't know at the time. The truth is, both sides were already undergoing the process of how to undermine the convention. And because Burgoyne's army were de facto prisoners of the Americans, they're the ones who got their way. We know for a fact there is a letter from General Howe himself to General Burgoyne. This letter was uncovered and transcribed recently by Todd Braystead, the Royalist American researcher extraordinaire. This letter overtly told Burgoyne that he, Howe, absolutely planned to recycle those British troops back to New York City. That was his plan. He was going to do it. Wow. And as for the Americans, what they did, the Congress made efforts to try to renege on the Convention of Saratoga and make Burgoyne's officers and soldiers prisoners of war. And that's exactly what they did by a resolution of Congress. in December of 1777.
Interesting. A little bit of
Oh, yeah.
trickery there between the two sides.
Yep.
So you mentioned that letter being uncovered. I want to go back to the battles of Saratoga because there's a story that's really been passed down, I think, through American myth and American memory of Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold butting heads constantly during the battles of Saratoga, the two battles. And you found a letter that sort of speaks a bit to the contrary of that. So go ahead and tell us a little bit more about that whole controversy. And before we went live, you were telling me a little bit about the historiography of this story as well, and where this myth, I guess, if you will, if you almost want to call it that, comes from, of Arnold and Gates not getting along with each other on the field.
Oh, I'd love to. Thanks for asking about it. It is one of my favorite subjects. Indeed, the stereotypical story that you'll read in most history books, or when you hear people talk about the battles of Saratoga, this is what they'll tell you, some variant of this. The first battle of Saratoga occurs. Horatio Gates, Benedict Arnold, after that battle, don't get along. It gets so bad that Horatio Gates ends up relieving Benedict Arnold of his command. Benedict Arnold has no command anymore, and he's been replaced by Benjamin Lincoln, second in command of the Northern Army. Then you have variants of the story tell you that Benedict Arnold was such a mischief maker that Gates had him put under arrest and confined. Then comes the day of the Second Battle of Saratoga, 7th of October, and Benedict Arnold notices that troops formerly from his division are marching out to the battle. He will not abide by that. So he breaks out of confinement, and he then goes off there, steals a horse, and goes off into the fight, and illegally starts to command troops in the battle. And he just directs things and, makes everything happen well enough to succeed in the battle, right? Horatio Gates then hears that Benedict Arnold is on the field, and he's befuddled by this. And so he has one of his aides to go out and fetch Benedict Arnold, bring him back into camp kicking and screaming because he shouldn't be out there. And so by the time this aide gets to Benedict Arnold, Arnold had already been wounded at the Bremen fortified camp during the assault on the flank of that German position. So this is the story we typically hear. And I remember when I started working at Saratoga Battlefield nearly 26 years ago, it was a few years into it, learning about the battles, reading more about the battles, thinking more about the battles, right? Applying critical thinking skills. I thought to myself, wait a minute, if that story's true or any version of it, right? Where was the court-martial? Why wasn't Benedict Arnold court-martialed for so egregiously disobeying a superior's orders, especially if that superior officer hated Arnold so much as he did, right? Gates hates Arnold. So where was the court-martial? And there was no court-martial. There was no call for court-martial. And in fact, Horatio Gates's letter to John Hancock reporting on what happened on the 7th of October was very flowery toward Benedict Arnold. He called Benedict Arnold gallant. And it's from this positive take on Arnold's participation in the battle that Congress passed a resolution instructing George Washington to fix Arnold's commission, which is something that was a real sore spot for Arnold throughout all of 1777. He wanted a commission that was backdated to the 19th of February, 1777, rather the one that he held, which was from May of 1777. Washington actually fixed it to the 17th of February. He gave Arnold 2 days seniority over other generals that had been previously passed over Arnold's head, such as Arthur Sinclair and Benjamin Lincoln. It all worked out well for Arnold, aside from the fact that he was so severely wounded in the leg that he can no longer, at least in the short term, command a division in the field, which is the thing he wanted more than anything to do. So this letter is revealed back in 2016. It was sold at auction. And very long story short, I remember this so well. I got the full view of the letter. The auction unfortunately had ended the day previously. I was put onto this letter by a very good friend of mine, Larry Arnold, who at the time was the president of our friends group, Friends of Saratoga Battlefield. And I'm reading the letter, and I'm reading it, and I thought, oh my gosh, this guy, this adjutant of a militia regiment from New Hampshire, is writing to his wife on the 9th of October, 2 days after the second battle were fought. And he is telling us something incredibly different than what we know, from what we read in the secondary sources about Arnold and Gates. And this guy writes from, he's writing to his wife, and he tells her that in this letter, I am going to tell you what my eyes and ears have been witness to, he says. And he talks about how his battalion arrived in camp on the 7th of October, which it did. We know in general orders that day, it specifically stated that Colonel Drakes's New Hampshire Militia Battalion was to be attached to Ebenezer Leonard's brigade. Ebenezer Leonard's brigade was part of Arnold's division. And so he goes in with the regiment, right? And he joins that brigade late that morning, early that afternoon, somewhere in there. Then he tells us that he goes to get the, well, he's the adjutant of the battalion, so he has to get the divisional orders. Where do you go? Divisional headquarters. Where's that? Arnold's headquarters in the Nielsen House. If you've been to Saratoga Battlefield, that little red house, that's the Nielsen House. That's original. It's not a replica. That was Arnold's headquarters. And so he goes there. And then as the battle is unfolding, he talks about meeting Gates and Arnold at that moment, because the British and are beginning they have moved out onto the wheat fields already, and American skirmishers, sentinels are shooting at them, and vice versa. And so he talks about how Arnold and Gates are planning the attack that develops. And Batchelor says this wonderful thing in this letter written to his wife. He says, and then Arnold says to Gates, give me some men and we shall have some fun with them before sunset. And Gates agrees. It's very clearly, and if you read the whole letter, it's very clearly Benedict Arnold who's telling Gates what the situation is, because he had gone out there to check things out himself. And then he advises Gates on what to do. And Gates agrees that that's the way to do it. It's very much Benedict Arnold's plan to make the attack on the British, which ends up being a very decisive victory. So I thought to myself, wait, if that's the case, what about all the other primary sources? Surely they're not going to jibe with this. Well, I embarked upon a very thorough reading of all primary sources from 1777 all the way through, letters, journals, you name it, everything, every single one of them. Surprisingly, perfectly agreed with Nathaniel Batchelor's accounting of things, including a letter written by Benjamin Lincoln himself in 1799, writing to William Heath. He confirmed all of this. And it's like, well, where did the history go wrong? James Wilkinson published his memoir in 1816. And in the letter, in the memoir, in his narrative, he completely changed everything. And in the long version of my narrative here, I know we're running out of time, unfortunately, but James Wilkinson had taken an account by Henry Dearborn of the Second Battle of Saratoga, in which Henry Dearborn gave Arnold credit for directing Morgan's Corps of Riflemen and Light Infantry on the field. James Wilkinson supplanted Arnold with himself. In my program on this subject, I compare the two narratives. Dearborn's accounting, at which he gave to Wilkinson to write his memoir, and then Wilkinson's spin. And Wilkinson made him out to be the hero in which Morgan then made his plans to attack the British. It's sick what James Wilkinson did. But come to find out, fast forward a couple years later in 1822, an early American historian was writing to a field officer, William Hull, who had been at the battles of Saratoga. And William Hull wrote back to this historian and said, quote, beware of Wilkinson, meaning the memoirs, beware of Wilkinson. He makes himself the hub upon which all things turned. I'm like, great line. I love it. Yes, yeah. That's exactly what that no good guy did. So fast forward, right? Wilkinson's published memoirs, 1816. 200 years later, 2016, the Nathaniel Batchelor letter is revealed after all this time, which triggers a massive research project into the history and the historiography. Because when you look at the historiography of the battles of Saratoga, the origin story of Benedict Arnold arrested, whatever, is all from Wilkinson. Jeez, amazing that you were able to piece that together, and I finally set the record straight. But yeah, shame on Wilkinson, I guess. I can see why your earlier comment now makes more sense about Wilkinson. But one last question I want to ask. I think many people probably know about it, but I would admit I know about it, but don't know much of the history about it related to Arnold. Is probably one of the more unique battlefield monuments anywhere in North America is just the Boot Monument, which of course is
well, I would say, from my limited knowledge of it, you know more than I do, a monument to Arnold, but it's a monument that does not name Arnold. So, what's a bit of the backstory of the boot monument there?
Yeah, the monument is indeed one of the probably the unique monument at Saratoga Battlefield. It's also the oldest monument on the battlefield. There are many monuments on the battlefield, not like Gettysburg, but there are a lot. You know, there are some dozen, there are maybe 2 dozen, let's say, and it's the oldest one, 1887. And it was put up on private property. The guy, John Watts de Peister, he's the guy who came up with the idea, came up with the funding, and he paid for the thing. And he wanted to commemorate Benedict Arnold, which nobody was doing that in the 1880s, you know, but he had recognized that Benedict Arnold was the hero of the battles of Saratoga. If you're going to pick one person, of course, it takes many people to win a battle, Daniel Morgan, etc. But if you're to pick one person, Benedict Arnold seems to be the guy, and I think that's fully justified too. So John Watts de Peister had this monument made in which on the obverse of the monument, it has a boot with an epaulette with 2 stars, signifying the idea that Arnold was a major general. He didn't have a 2-starred epaulette. That comes a little later in the Revolutionary War when you distinguish rank with stars. Instead, to show that he was a major general, he would have worn, of all things, a purple riband across his chest, over his vest, under his coat. But you also have a crown with a laurel wreath and a howitzer on this obverse of the monument. And then on the reverse, there's an inscription with the date. And it talks about how, I don't remember the exact phraseology, but it's something about how this in commemoration of this general who was the most brilliant general of the army. It does not mention Arnold's name, indeed, because at that time, you know, in the 1880s, nobody thinks of Arnold as anything but a traitor, and he was a traitor, absolutely. And the feeling was that, you know, to make a monument to a man who betrayed his country on par with making other monuments to people who didn't betray their country doesn't seem right, you know? Why would we have a monument to Nathaniel Greene and have a monument to Benedict Arnold, have them be equal? That doesn't seem fair. You know, Nathaniel Greene only did great things for the United States. Benedict Arnold, great things, but awful things too. So the idea was that, okay, monument, cool, but with no name. That was the settlement. We don't know who came up with that idea, but maybe it was John Watts de Peister himself.
Yeah, very, very unique monument, and something that I think immediately upon walking up to the rear of Brayman's Redoubt, you just are drawn to seeing it and to taking a look at it. So we just got a couple minutes left. Unfortunately, this has been a really great conversation. We've touched on a lot about the Saratoga campaign, on the battles as well, and about all the great research you've been doing to highlight the roles of not just generals like Arnold and Gates, but of the private soldiers as well. But tell us a little bit about what's going on right now at Saratoga National Historical Park. Any projects going on around the park, whether logistically construction projects or some research projects you're working on as well?
Oh, wow. Yeah, we have a lot. So at the battlefield itself, the biggest project by far is a multi-million-dollar rehabilitation project. If you've been to the battlefield over the last couple of decades, you might have seen that over time, the pavement infrastructure I should go back a little bit. What we have is a 10-mile long tour road, which you drive on, and it loops through the battlefield. And you can have the option of stopping at the various 10 historic stops that we have on that tour road. And over time, if you've been to the battlefield in, unfortunately, the past few decades, the infrastructure at those various tour stops has been crumbling. Sinkholes had developed. You have sections that had to be repaved, and some of the repavement hasn't meshed well with the original pavement, so it creates buckling, and it creates other issues in which people in wheelchairs wouldn't be able to easily traverse the ground. The tour road stops. Some of those pathways were made at a time in the 1950s when, you know, they didn't really consider ADA standards like we do today, so that you know, we want all visitors to be able to experience these different sites, to see where the American Army camped, to see where the British forces camped, to see where the battles were fought. And unfortunately, that wasn't, you know, a thing that all visitors could do. Further, all of our wayside exhibits, those signs with the narrative of the battle and the pictures and all that stuff, right? Those were in very, very poor condition. very poor condition, and it was just getting worse over time. So anyway, multi-million-dollar project in which all of this stuff will be completely overhauled. All of the old asphalt removed and replaced, some of the pathways rerouted so that now it is going to be, when the project's finished, 100% ADA compliant. All new wayside exhibits. So no longer will we have wayside exhibits from the 1950s and 1970s. Now they'll be from the 2020s. So that's a very exciting thing, with updated narrative and historical information. Now, it's taking a very long time because this is a very serious, very labor-intensive project. Parts of the tour road have been closed all year and probably will be into next year. But by some point, hopefully by the summer of next year, we'll have everything up and running, and it's going to be better than ever.
Well, that's great. It sounds like whether you're planning on visiting Saratoga National Historical Park for the first time or going back for the 25th or 26th time or beyond, it sounds like next year will be a great time to go see it and see all the updates that you all have done and are continuing to work on at the park. And I can just say Saratoga is one of my favorite parks that I've been to, one of my favorite Revolution sites that I've been to. So Eric, it's been a really great pleasure chatting with you this evening. For folks listening, again, come out and see Eric at Saratoga National Historical Park. You won't be disappointed by Eric's narrative or the park at all. And join us in just a couple of weeks for our next Emerging Revolutionary War Revelry that we will have. Stay tuned to our website, emergingrevolutionarywar.org, for our updated schedule of events. And of course, our upcoming bus tour, with a few tickets still remaining, so you can purchase those tickets online as well. So Eric, again, a great big thank you for all the ground that you covered tonight. This was a fascinating conversation. I know I really enjoyed it. I'm sure others did as well. And we know you're busy, so we appreciate you taking a little bit of time out of your schedule to share with us the story of Saratoga.
It was a pleasure, Kevin. Thank you for inviting me to share these stories. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you kindly.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And all thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again in just a couple of weeks.